Joel Harker paid $11,000 for a lighthouse that hadn't been lit in 31 years, and everyone in Rockport thought he'd finally lost his mind completely. Maybe they were right. He wasn't sure anymore. He'd stopped being sure of most things somewhere between his third deployment and the parking lot of a VA hospital in San Diego, where a nurse had handed him a manila folder, said, "Thank you for your service," and walked back inside without looking at him again. That was 4 years ago. He'd been sleeping in his truck since February. The lighthouse sat on the edge of Gloucester Harbor, Massachusetts, on a rocky finger of land that jutted into the Atlantic like a broken tooth. It had been decommissioned in 1993 when the Coast Guard switched to an automated buoy system. The keeper's house attached to its base had gone through 2 private owners after that, both of whom had filed permits to renovate, and then quietly walked away when the structural reports came back. The property had sat in county receivership for 9 years. The auction listing described it as historic maritime structure, ASIS condition, significant deferred maintenance. The photo showed peeling red paint and a window boarded with plywood that said "Keep Out" in spray-painted orange letters. Joel had found the listing on a library computer in Portsmouth, New Hampshire, on a Tuesday morning in March when the temperature outside was 19 degrees. He'd been using the library for its heat. Ranger was not allowed inside, so Joel had left him tied to a bike rack with a bowl of water and a blanket, and Ranger had sat there with his ears up, watching the door, waiting. That was what Ranger did. He waited. He had been waiting for Joel since the day they'd been partnered in Kandahar in 2009, and he had not stopped. Ranger was 11 years old now, which was old for a German shepherd. Old especially for one who had spent 4 years working EOD sweeps in Afghanistan. He moved slower than he used to. His muzzle had gone almost entirely white. He had a scar along his left flank from a piece of shrapnel that Joel had pulled out with forceps in a forward operating base while Ranger lay perfectly still and watched Joel's face with complete, unblinking trust. Joel still thought about that sometimes. The way Ranger had looked at him, not scared, just watching, as if to say, "I know you've got this." Joel had printed the auction listing and folded it into his jacket pocket. He hadn't known why exactly. He had $11,000 in a savings account, the last of a combat disability payment that he hadn't been able to spend because spending it felt like admitting he needed it. He drove to Rockport the next morning and stood on the dock and looked at the lighthouse for a long time without going closer. Ranger stood beside him, leaning slightly against his leg, which was what he did when he sensed Joel was thinking too hard. "It's a wreck," Joel said out loud. Ranger didn't disagree, but he also didn't look away from it. Joel bought it 3 weeks later for $10,900, which was the opening bid and also the only bid. The county clerk who processed the paperwork had looked at him with an expression that was not quite pity and not quite judgment, but somewhere uncomfortably in between. "You know the access road floods at high tide," she said. "I know," Joel said. He didn't know. And the keeper's house. The inspection from 2019 noted severe moisture intrusion in the foundation. The report used the word compromised 7 times. "I read it," Joel said. He had not read it. She had stamped his paperwork and handed it across the counter. Good luck then. He was going to need it. The first night, he and Ranger slept in the truck parked in front of the keeper's house because Joel wanted to be sure the floor would hold before he put weight on it. He sat in the driver's seat with the window cracked, listening to the ocean, which was not a peaceful sound the way people who had never lived near the ocean seemed to think. It was loud and constant and indifferent in a way that reminded him of a lot of things he tried not to think about. Ranger slept in the passenger seat with his chin on Joel's thigh. In the morning, Joel did a slow walkthrough of the keeper's house. It was 6 rooms total, a kitchen, a sitting room, 2 small bedrooms, a bathroom with a clawfoot tub that had turned the color of old bone, and a narrow back room that opened directly onto the base of the lighthouse tower. The ceilings were intact. The floors creaked, but held. The moisture intrusion the inspector had noted was real and serious. The northeast corner of the kitchen showed clear water damage going up the wall, and there was a smell, deep, old, organic, that told him the subfloor underneath had been wet for a very long time. But the bones were there. Joel could see it. Beneath the rot, and the salt damage, and the 30 years of neglect, there was something solid. He stood in the sitting room and looked through the salt-hazed window at the harbor. And for the first time in 4 years, he felt something that wasn't quite hope, but was maybe in the same neighborhood. Ranger was exploring. He moved through the room slowly, nose working, stopping occasionally to investigate a corner or a baseboard or a spot on the wall that seemed identical to every other spot on the wall. He had always done this. It was his training, but more than that, it was just who he was. Ranger had never learned to turn it off, and Joel had never wanted him to. He disappeared into the back room for a while. Joel didn't think much of it. He went to the truck and got his tools. The work was hard and slow and relentless in the way that physical labor always was, which Joel had come to understand was actually a mercy. When his hands were busy, his brain had somewhere to be. He tore out the rotted subfloor in the kitchen corner. He patched a section of roof where daylight was coming through. He replaced 3 joists. He did it methodically, the way he'd been trained to do everything: assess, prioritize, execute, reassess. He was not a man who talked much. He had never been, even before the deployments. Afterward, words had become even more expensive somehow, like a currency he was always running low on. But he talked to Ranger, had for years, in Kandahar, in Ramadi, in the truck outside a rest stop in Iowa, at 3 in the morning when he couldn't sleep, and the silence inside his own head was too loud. Ranger always listened with the same quality of attention, completely, without interruption, without offering solutions he hadn't been asked for. Left corner of the kitchen is going to need a new sill plate, Joel told him one evening in April. Probably the rim joist, too. That's another $400 I don't have yet. Ranger was sitting by the door to the back room. He looked at Joel, then looked at the door, then looked at Joel again. "What?" Joel said. Ranger stood up and walked to the door and sat back down in front of it. Joel crossed the room and opened it. Ranger went inside. Joel followed. The back room was narrow, maybe 8 feet wide, running the full depth of the house before it hit the stone base of the lighthouse tower. It had probably been used for storage originally. There were old iron hooks along one wall, the kind used for hanging oilskins. The floors were stone here, cold and solid in a way the wooden floors elsewhere were not. A single bare bulb hung from a wire in the ceiling, and Joel had replaced it with an LED the first week. Ranger went to the far wall, the wall that met the base of the lighthouse tower, and sat down facing it. His ears were forward. His body was still. "There's nothing there," Joel said. Ranger looked at the wall. Joel knocked on it. Hollow, slightly, on the left side. Not as hollow as a cavity, but not the solid stone it should have been either. He pressed his palm flat against it, and felt the subtle wrongness of it. The wall was not stone all the way through here. There was something between the stones, or behind them, filling a space that shouldn't exist. He picked up a pry bar from his tool pile and worked it into the mortar seam along the left edge. The mortar was old, not crumbling, but not original either. Someone had repointed this section at some point, carefully, almost invisibly. If you weren't looking for it, you wouldn't see it. He worked for 40 minutes. Ranger did not move. The stones came loose one at a time, and behind them was a space. Not large, maybe 18 inches deep and 2 feet wide, framed in old timber that had dried to the hardness of iron. Inside the space was a metal box, the kind that had been made for fireproof document storage in the mid-20th century, olive green with a black handle, stamped with the initials BHC. Joel set it on the stone floor and looked at it for a moment. Ranger sniffed it once, thoroughly, and then sat back. The box was locked, but the lock was the kind that had been designed for security in 1962, and was therefore no obstacle to a man who had disassembled and reassembled a great variety of mechanisms under significantly more stressful conditions. It took him 9 minutes. Inside was a sealed envelope, a folded survey map, and a notarized document on paper that had yellowed at the edges but remained legible, dense with legal language, dated June 14, 1988, bearing the seal of the Commonwealth of Massachusetts and the signature of one Bernard Harold Cavendish. Joel read it slowly. Then he read it again. Then he sat down on the stone floor of the back room and pressed his back against the lighthouse wall and stared at the ceiling for a long time. Bernard Harold Cavendish had been the last keeper of this lighthouse. Joel had known that much from the deed he'd received at the county clerk's office. Cavendish had lived here from 1961 until the decommissioning in 1993, a span of 32 years, most of his adult life given to tending a light that guided ships into a harbor that already had GPS and radio and every modern navigation instrument available by the time the Coast Guard finally turned the light off. He had refused to leave for 2 years after the decommissioning, and the Coast Guard had eventually let him stay on as a private citizen in a property they no longer wanted to maintain. He had died in 1997. No children, no spouse. He had been married once, briefly, in the 1950s, and his wife had left and he had never spoken of her again. According to a small article Joel found later in the Gloucester Daily Times archives, he had left the property to a nephew who had never come to claim it, and the estate had eventually passed into county receivership through a series of legal steps so slow and bureaucratic they had taken 11 years. What the county records did not contain, what nobody had known about, apparently, because the document had been sealed inside a metal box, sealed inside a stone wall, was that Bernard Cavendish had also owned, outright and free of encumbrance, a 14-acre parcel of land on the south shore of Cape Ann, 14 acres of waterfront land on Cape Ann, Massachusetts, assessed in 1988 at $400,000, which meant that at current market rates, Joel had checked on his phone from the library's Wi-Fi 2 days later. Hands that were not entirely steady. It was worth somewhere between $8 and $12 million, depending on how you counted the tidal wetlands and the riparian rights and a small cottage on the property that had been standing since 1922. The deed named no beneficiary beyond the lawful owner of Lighthouse, Parcel 14A, Rockport, Gloucester County, Massachusetts, which, as of $10,900 and a county clerk's stamp, was Joel Harker. He didn't tell anyone for 2 weeks. This was partly because he didn't know who to tell. He had no family worth speaking of. A brother in Phoenix he hadn't talked to in 6 years, a mother in a memory care facility in Savannah, who no longer knew his name. He had former teammates scattered across the country, most of them managing their own versions of the same fog he'd been living in. And none of them were the kind of men you called with news you didn't know how to explain yet. It was also partly because he didn't quite believe it. He had read the document a dozen times. He had driven to the Cape Ann parcel and stood at the edge of it, and looked at the water and the old cottage and the way the light fell on the grass in the late afternoon. And it had felt so far outside. The range of things that happened to men like him that he couldn't fully integrate it. Ranger walked the perimeter of the 14 acres slowly, methodically, stopping to mark several fence posts and investigate a cluster of wild roses near the eastern edge with the serious attention he gave to everything. "You found it," Joel told him, standing at the waterline. Ranger came back to stand beside him, pressed his shoulder against Joel's leg. Joel put his hand on Ranger's head. The old dog's ears went back slightly. Not in distress, just in the particular way they went when he was being touched by Joel. Relaxed. Home. The lawyer's name was Deborah Fitch, and she was 72 years old. had been practicing property law in Gloucester for 45 years, and had the kind of manner that made you feel like she had seen everything, and would not be surprised by anything, which Joel appreciated more than he could say. He sat across from her in an office that smelled like old books and coffee, and showed her the document and the survey map and the metal box with BHC stamped on the side. She read it carefully. She flipped through the survey map. She set everything down and looked at him over her reading glasses. "How long have you owned the Lighthouse property?" she said. "Since March. And you found this sealed in the wall?" "Yes." "And you haven't contacted anyone else about this?" "No." She considered him for a moment. "Mr. Harker, do you understand what this is?" "I think so," Joel said. "I was hoping you could tell me if I'm right." She leaned back in her chair. Under Massachusetts property law, a deed conveying title by reference to the owner of a specific parcel, as this one does, transfers with the parcel. The county's chain of title on the Lighthouse property was clean. You own it outright, which means this conveyance, assuming it holds up to title examination, and I believe it will, makes you the lawful owner of that Cape Ann parcel as well. Joel looked at his hands. "Okay," he said. "Do you understand what that land is worth?" "I looked it up, and—" He looked up at her. "I don't know what to do with $12 million, he said. It came out more honest than he'd intended. Deborah Fitch studied him for a moment. Then she said, quietly, "Not many people who say that actually mean it." "I mean it," Joel said. She nodded once, slowly, in a way that suggested she believed him. The title examination took 6 weeks. During those 6 weeks, Joel kept working on the keeper's house. He fixed the sill plate. He replaced the rim joist. He patched the exterior trim on the south face where the paint had blistered and peeled down to bare wood. He cleaned 30 years of salt and grime off the lighthouse lantern room glass, which took 3 days and ruined 4 chamois cloths, and produced in him a quiet satisfaction he hadn't felt in a long time. Ranger supervised all of this from various strategic positions around the property. He had a particular fondness for the flat rock at the harbor's edge, where the morning sun hit at an angle that seemed designed specifically for an old dog with stiff joints. And he spent considerable time there between rounds of inspection. Some mornings Joel would make coffee on the camping stove he'd set up in the kitchen, and bring a cup outside and sit next to Ranger on that rock, and they would both watch the harbor together. The lobster boats going out before dawn, the way the light changed as the sun came up. First gray, then rose, then a clean hard gold that turned the water into something worth looking at. Joel had not watched a sunrise in a very long time. He had been awake for many of them, but watching was different from just being awake. Watching meant you were present enough to see it. He was starting to be present enough to see it. A woman named Lydia came into his life sideways, the way most important things did. She ran the small marine supply shop on the commercial wharf in Rockport. The kind of place that sold rope and bilge pumps and weather gear, and had a bulletin board near the register where people posted notices about boats for sale and moorings available and odd jobs wanted. Joel had gone in for caulk and sandpaper in mid-April, and she had rung him up and then said, without looking up from the register, "You're the one who bought the Lighthouse." "Yes," he said, "Bernard's place." He looked at her then. She was somewhere around his age, late 40s, early 50s, with short dark hair going gray at the temples and the kind of weathered, direct face that came from spending a lot of years near the ocean. She was looking at him with an expression that was not unfriendly but was not casual either. "You knew him?" Joel said. "My grandfather did. They were friends." She handed him his change. "Bernard used to bring fish down to the wharf to trade in the 50s, before he took the keeper job. My grandfather said he was the most patient man he'd ever met. Said he could watch a storm come in for 6 hours and never once look like he wanted to be somewhere else." Joel thought about that. "That sounds like someone who knew how to wait," he said. "Most lighthouse keepers were," she said. That was most of the job. He came back for more sandpaper 3 days later, which they both understood was not about sandpaper. Lydia knew the harbor the way Joel knew his own hands. Every channel, every shoal, every dock and mooring, and the rough history of everyone who had worked them for the last 50 years. She had grown up here. She had left once, for 11 years. Married, and then divorced, and rebuilt herself from scratch in the same town where everyone knew what had happened, which Joel came to understand was its own kind of courage. She brought him a casserole one evening in May, without calling first, because she was not the kind of person who asked permission before doing a practical thing. She stood in the door of the keeper's house with the casserole dish and looked around at the work he'd done and said, "You're better at this than I expected." "What did you expect?" Joel said. "I'm not sure. Something sadder." He let her in. Ranger came to investigate and then decided she was acceptable, which was not something Ranger decided quickly. They ate at the workbench because Joel didn't have a table yet. Lydia looked at the lantern room visible through the narrow tower door and said, "Did you ever go up?" "A few times," Joel said. "Does the mechanism still work?" "The rotation gear is seized." "I've been working on it." She looked at him. "You're going to try to light it." "I'm going to try to get it running," he said. "Whether it gets lit is a different conversation. You'd need a Coast Guard permit for a navigational light." "I know. Bernard always said the harbor was safer when it was running." She said it simply, not as an argument, just as something that was true. Joel looked at the tower. "I know," he said again, differently this time. The title examination came back clean in the first week of June. Deborah Fitch called him on a Wednesday morning, and Joel was on the roof patching, flashing around the lantern room base when his phone rang. He came down the ladder and answered it standing at the base of the tower with Ranger at his feet. "It's yours," she said. "All of it. The Cape Ann parcel, the cottage, the riparian rights. Clean title. No competing claims. I've drafted the formal confirmation of conveyance. You can come in to sign whenever you're ready." Joel stood there with the phone against his ear and looked out at the harbor. A lobster boat was crossing the mouth of the cove, moving slow and steady, the way things moved out here that knew where they were going. "Thank you," he said. "There's one more thing," Deborah said. "I did some research on Bernard Cavendish when I was running the title. There's an oral history project at the Cape Ann Museum. They interviewed him in 1995, 2 years before he died. I think you might want to listen to it." He went the next day. The recording was 47 minutes long, Bernard Cavendish's voice coming out of a cassette-to-digital transfer with a slight warble to it. The way old recordings always sounded. Like the past trying to hold on to itself. He talked about the lighthouse. He talked about the harbor. He talked about the fog signals and the rotation schedule, and a winter storm in 1978 that had taken down the old fog bell tower, and how he'd stood in the lantern room for 19 hours straight, hand-signaling ships with a mirror because the electrical system had shorted in the water intrusion, and 3 ships had made it into harbor that night that would not have made it otherwise. Toward the end of the recording, the interviewer asked Bernard if he had any regrets about giving his life to the lighthouse. There was a pause. The tape warbled. Then Bernard said, "I had a dog years ago when I first came here, Black Lab. Name was Henry. Henry used to know when the weather was turning before any instrument I had. I'd watch him and I'd know, this one's going to be bad, or this one's going to blow through. People think dogs are just animals. Henry knew things. He looked out for me." Another pause. "I should have had more like that in my life. People who just looked out for you without wanting something in return. It's rarer than you think." Joel sat in the museum's listening room for a long time after the tape ended. Then he went outside to where he'd left Ranger tied in the shade of an oak tree on the museum lawn. And Ranger stood up immediately when he saw Joel's face and came to the end of the leash and pushed his head against Joel's chest. Joel put his arms around the old dog and stayed there for a minute. "Yeah," he said, against the white fur of Ranger's ear. "Me too." He did not sell the Cape Ann parcel. This surprised Deborah Fitch and seemed to confuse the realtor she'd referred him to, who had called twice with buyers before Joel had politely stopped taking his calls. What he did instead started with a conversation with Lydia on a Tuesday evening in late June, sitting on the flat rock at the harbor's edge with coffee, watching the water go dark as the sun went down. "What do you need?" she had asked him. Not in a leading way. She was not a leading person, just asking. "I don't need much," Joel said. "I never did." "Then what do you want?" He thought about it for a long time. Ranger was lying between them with his chin on his forepaws, watching the water. "I want the lighthouse running again," Joel said. "I want the permit. I want a proper rotation." He paused. "And I want the cottage on the Cape Ann property fixed up for what?" "For veterans," he said. "The ones who are where I was, who just need somewhere. Somewhere that's theirs for a while they figure out the next thing." He looked at the water. "It doesn't fix everything, but I know what it meant to have somewhere. This place, even before I knew about the Cape Ann land. Just this rock and Ranger and the harbor." Lydia was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "There's a VA social worker in Gloucester who's been trying to find transitional housing placements for 2 years. I know her." "I know," Joel said. "Deborah mentioned her." Lydia looked at him. "You've already been thinking about this for a while," he said. She looked back at the water. "How many can the cottage hold?" 4, maybe 6 if we add a bedroom. The land could hold a second structure eventually. They sat there as the harbor went dark and the lights came on across the water. And it wasn't awkward or rushed or full of the particular weight that most conversations carried. It was just 2 people watching the same water and thinking about the same thing from different directions, until they met somewhere in the middle. The Coast Guard permit for the lighthouse came through on a Friday in August. Joel had spent 3 weeks on the rotation mechanism, cleaning the seized gear, replacing the corroded drive shaft, sourcing a period-appropriate lens prism through a maritime salvage dealer in Portland who seemed genuinely delighted to find someone who wanted one. The electrical system had to be completely rewired, which he'd brought in a licensed electrician to do, paid for out of the first formal disbursement from the Cape Ann land that he'd put in trust for the Veterans Program. Lydia was there the night he lit it. So was the VA social worker, a compact, serious woman named Andrea, who had shown up with 2 of her veteran clients, both of whom stood on the dock and watched the lighthouse beam sweep out across the harbor without speaking. Ranger was there too. He sat at Joel's left side on the dock and watched the beam go out, and then he looked up at Joel with an expression that was very difficult to read if you didn't know him, and completely clear if you did. Joel crouched down and scratched behind his ears. The left one, the one Ranger always preferred. The old dog leaned into his hand. His eyes were a little cloudy now at the edges. His muzzle was pure white. He was slower than he'd been, and would be slower still as the months went on. And Joel knew what was coming at the end of that road, and had made a kind of peace with it that was not really peace, but was the thing you substituted for peace when peace wasn't available. But not tonight. Tonight, Ranger was here and warm and leaning into his hand, and the lighthouse was turning again. For the first time in 31 years, the beam sweeping clean and steady across the harbor, and the lobstermen coming in late would see it and know where they were. Bernard Cavendish had stood in this light for 32 years and guided ships home. Joel figured he could do the same. He stood back up and put his hand in his jacket pocket, and felt the original document, the deed, the conveyance, that he'd been carrying there since June, the way some men carried a photograph or a rosary, or some other small thing that reminded them what they were doing and why. Ranger pressed against his leg. The light swept out across the water. "Good boy," Joel said quietly. "Not as a reward, just as a fact. the most honest thing he knew how to say. "Good boy." The harbor answered the way it always did. Constant, indifferent, enormous. And for the first time in a long time, Joel Harker found that was enough.